The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Hospital buzzed with the kind of persistence that measured time in aches
You
rather
can't
than
just
hours.
walk out like that!
Marcus Reed
I have
pushed
every
the
right to leave
transport
if I
gurney
want
down
to.
the corridor with practiced efficiency. The wheels squeaking against linoleum worn smooth by decades of similar journeys. 10 hours into his shift, exhaustion lived in his shoulders, but his hands stayed steady. They always did when someone needed them. The elderly woman on the gurney clutched his arm, her breathing rapid and shallow. Bad news waited in radiology, and fear had a way of making the body forget its own rhythm. Marcus slowed his pace, leaned closer. His voice dropped to a register that cut through panic without adding to the noise already filling her head. 4 counts in. Hold it. 4 counts out. She tried to follow, failed, gasped. He placed his free hand over hers, the weight of it an anchor. You're safe. I've got you. Try again with me. This time her lungs found the pattern. By the time they reached the imaging department, color had returned to her cheeks. A nurse met them at the door, glanced at the chart, then at Marcus with an expression that carried equal parts gratitude and something that looked like frustration. You have a gift for this, you know that. Marcus shrugged, already turning the gurney over to her care. His shift ended in 15 minutes, and Cole's text had been waiting since lunch. The drawing attached showed 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, holding hands beneath a sun that took up half the digital page. The caption read simply, "Love you, Dad." Dr. Sarah Okonkwo stood near the nurse's station, arms crossed, watching him. With that particular intensity that meant she had thoughts she planned to share, whether he wanted to hear them or not. She'd supervised the orderly staff for 3 years and had stopped trying to convince him to aim higher after the first 6 months. Now she just observed, waiting for something to shift. "Marcus, a word." He paused, glanced at the clock. She caught the look. "This won't take long. You could have been more than this." The statement hung in the sterile air between them, neither accusation nor compliment. Marcus met her eyes, saw genuine concern there, and chose his words with care. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Flexible hours mean I pick up Cole after school, help with homework, cook dinner that isn't frozen. And the skills you have, the training, I use them every shift." Dr. Okonkwo studied him for another beat, then nodded once. She understood the choice even if she didn't agree with it. Some men built empires, others built lives. Marcus had chosen his foundation years ago, and nothing about wealth or status could make him second-guess the architecture of what he'd constructed from the wreckage of his marriage. He changed in the staff locker room, trading the hospital scrubs for a clean button-down shirt he'd ironed that morning before Cole woke. The fabric was thin at the elbows, purchased from a discount rack 3 years prior, but it was pressed and tucked and paired with jeans that had been washed enough times to soften into comfort without crossing into shabby. A blind date required effort, and Marcus had learned long ago that dignity came from trying, not from the price tag. The bus stop outside the hospital smelled of exhaust and rain that hadn't quite decided to fall. Marcus checked his phone while waiting, scrolling through the dating profile one more time. Brooke, 35, professional. The word meant nothing and everything. Her photo showed blonde hair pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency over vanity, blue eyes that assessed rather than invited, and a smile that looked like it had been scheduled between meetings. The setup had come through a co-worker who swore they'd be perfect together, a claim Marcus doubted but had been too tired to refuse. 2 years of solo parenting had worn down his resistance to well-meaning interference. If nothing else, dinner conversation would beat reheating leftovers while Cole practiced multiplication tables. The bus arrived 6 minutes late, crowded with the shift change from downtown offices. Marcus found a spot near the rear exit, wedged between a teenager with headphones bleeding hip-hop and a woman whose grocery bags took up more space than her body. 3 stops from the restaurant, a man in the middle seat started breathing wrong. The sound cut through the ambient noise like a knife through cloth, sharp and desperate. Gasping breaths too fast, chest heaving in a rhythm that signaled panic rather than physical distress. Heads turned. People shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered about calling for help, but no one moved. The paralysis of crowds facing crisis without instruction spread like a virus through the cramped space. Marcus stood without thinking. The teenager's music kept playing. The woman's grocery bags rustled. He moved down the aisle and dropped into the seat beside the panicking man whose eyes had gone wide and unfocused, locked on some invisible threat that lived only in the chemistry misfiring through his nervous system. "Hey, look at me." The man's gaze skittered past around everywhere except toward the voice offering an anchor. Marcus reached out slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand on the man's shoulder. Firm pressure, real contact, something to ground the spiraling mind in the physical world it had temporarily abandoned. "I need you to breathe with me. In for 4 counts. Hold it. Out for 4 counts. Can you try?" The man shook his head, gasping. Marcus checked his watch, the simple analog face showing 6:28 p.m., and started counting aloud, his voice steady and low enough that only the immediate seats could hear. 1, 2, 3, 4. He inhaled, visibly chest expanding, modeling the behavior he was asking for. Hold. Then exhaled, slow and controlled. The man tried, failed, tried again. On the 3rd attempt, his breathing started to match the pattern. Color began returning to his face. The tension in his shoulders eased by millimeters, then inches. Marcus kept counting, kept breathing, kept his hand exactly where it was until the panic released its grip and the man sagged back against the seat, exhausted but present. "You're okay. You're safe. This will pass." The man nodded, unable to speak yet, but his eyes had found focus again. A woman across the aisle whispered to her companion something about doctors in training. Marcus stood, moved back to his original spot, and pulled the cord for his stop as if nothing had interrupted the journey. The teenager never looked up. The woman with groceries offered a small, uncertain smile. By the time Marcus stepped off the bus, evening had settled into the city streets with the weight of accumulated humidity. Pittsburgh's summer pressed down on everyone, equally indifferent to bank accounts or job titles. He walked the 2 blocks to Marchand's restaurant with his jacket folded over his arm, already feeling underdressed despite his efforts. The restaurant announced itself through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed diners like paintings in a gallery of affluence. Chandeliers that probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months cast warm light over white tablecloths and silverware that gleamed with the kind of polish that required staff dedicated solely to its maintenance. He paused outside, smoothed his shirt one more time, and pushed through the heavy oak door. Cool air conditioning hit him first, then the smell of butter and herbs and meat being prepared by people who understood the difference between cooking and cuisine. The hostess stand commanded the entryway like a checkpoint, and the woman behind it had perfected the art of assessment disguised as hospitality. Her eyes traveled from Marcus's scuffed work boots up to his off-the-rack shirt, lingering on the grass stain at his knee that he'd somehow missed during his hurried change. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Marcus stepped forward, shoulders straight despite the exhaustion pulling at them. 7 o'clock. Name's Reed." The hostess consulted her tablet, manicured fingernails clicking against the screen. Her expression shifted in ways too subtle for most people to notice. But Marcus had spent years reading faces across cultural and language barriers in places where misunderstanding got people killed. She'd found his reservation. She'd also drawn conclusions. "Reed, and you're meeting someone this evening. Blind date. Her name's Brooke." The hostess glanced up sharply, scanned the dining room, and landed on a woman seated alone near the windows. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the elegant cut of her blazer, the way she held her wine glass with casual ownership, the phone in her other hand. Reflecting light as she scrolled through what looked like work emails during what should have been personal time. The hostess's smile tightened into something that resembled professional courtesy, but carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood if anyone looked too closely. "I think there may be some confusion, Mr. Reed. That particular table is reserved for one of our regular guests. The reservation's under Reed for 2 people at 7. Her voice climbed just loud enough for nearby tables to register the conversation without being able to distinguish the words. The tone communicated everything the content left ambiguous: amusement, disbelief, the kind of condescension that wrapped itself in politeness while landing with the impact of a fist. "Sir, you're at the wrong table. I'm sure we can find accommodations more suitable to your situation." The pause before that final word carried weight that had nothing to do with seating arrangements. Marcus felt it land, felt the familiar burn of being measured by appearance, and found wanting, felt the eyes of other diners beginning to turn toward the disturbance rippling through their expensive evening. His jaw tightened. His hands wanted to curl into fists, but he kept them loose, kept his breathing even, kept his voice level when he responded. "Should I wait at the bar while you check with her?" The hostess glanced toward Brooke's table again, seemed to consider the idea, then shook her head with finality that brooked no argument. "I think perhaps you'd be more comfortable at another establishment. I can recommend several nearby options that might better suit your needs." The words landed like a verdict delivered from a bench that had already decided guilt before hearing evidence. Marcus stood in the entryway of this temple to wealth and taste, wearing his carefully ironed shirt and his honest exhaustion, and understood that nothing he said would change the judgment being passed. He could argue, could demand to speak with a manager, could pull out his phone and show the text messages confirming the reservation, the profile that matched his face, the proof that he belonged here by every metric except the one that apparently mattered most. Instead, he nodded once. "Thank you for your time." He turned toward the door with deliberate slowness, refusing to let humiliation translate into hurried retreat. His spine stayed straight. His shoulders stayed back. The jacket folded over his arm might as well have been a flag he refused to lower even in defeat. People watched him go with varying degrees of interest or indifference, their evening's entertainment wrapped in the spectacle of someone being reminded of their place. Near the windows, Brooke Sullivan sat with her phone forgotten in her hand, wineglass arrested halfway to her lips, staring at the man being escorted out by the hostess's pointed dismissal. Something about his posture triggered recognition that her conscious mind hadn't yet caught up with. The way he moved, careful and controlled, like he expected fragile things to appear in his path at any moment. The hands that held his jacket with deliberate precision, the shoulders that carried weight invisibly. Her wrist throbbed beneath its brace, the injury from this afternoon suddenly screaming for attention. It hadn't demanded in hours. Memory crashed over her like a wave she'd been too busy to notice building. Broken glass, twisted metal, the sick crunch of impact still echoing in her bones, pain blooming bright and immediate, chaos of voices all talking over each other. No one taking charge, everyone looking for someone else to tell them what to do. And then hands steady, sure, competent, cutting through the panic with the kind of authority that required no announcement. Those hands. The realization hit her with enough force to make her stand abruptly, her chair scraping against polished hardwood with a sound that carried across the dining room like a gunshot in a cathedral. Conversations faltered, forks paused halfway to mouths. The carefully maintained atmosphere of sophisticated dining developed a crack that spread outward from her table in ripples of curiosity and concern. "Wait." The single word came out louder than she'd intended, sharper, weighted with urgency that had nothing to do with social grace and everything to do with the sudden, horrifying understanding of what had just happened. Marcus stopped with his hand on the door, confused by a summons that made no sense given the last 5 minutes of his life. He turned slowly, and their eyes met across the distance of expensive carpet and uncomfortable silence. Brooke moved before conscious thought caught up with muscle memory. Her heels clicked against the floor as she closed the space between them, ignoring the hostess's expression of dawning comprehension and horror. Ignoring the elderly couple at table 6 who'd leaned forward to get a better view of drama unfolding better than any play they could have purchased tickets for. Recognition hit Marcus a beat behind her movement toward him, his brain finally processing what his body already knew. The woman from the accident, the one whose door he'd had to carefully pry wider, whose pulse he'd checked with fingers that knew exactly how hard to press, whose breathing he'd counted out loud because numbers sometimes helped when everything else felt like it was ending. She reached him, and he could see the brace peeking out from beneath her sleeve. Could see the small butterfly bandage at her temple marking where glass had kissed skin. Could see the way she held herself slightly off-center to favor ribs that had probably met steering wheel hard enough to bruise but not hard enough to break. "You helped me." The words came out unsteady somewhere between statement and question and accusation, though who she was accusing remained unclear. Maybe herself, maybe the universe, maybe the hostess who'd just tried to erase him from a building he had every right to enter. "This afternoon, the accident, you didn't leave." Marcus nodded once, his voice dropping into the same register he'd used when she'd been bleeding in crumpled metal when calm had been the only thing keeping shock at bay. "You were hurt, someone needed to stay. That's all you're going to say." The question carried disbelief but also something warmer, something that recognized the profound simplicity of his response for what it was. Not humility, not deflection, just truth stripped of any need for elaboration. It's what mattered. The hostess had gone pale, her confidence evaporating as she reassessed a situation she'd already judged and dismissed. Other diners weren't even pretending not to watch now. The elderly man at table 6 leaned toward his wife, whispering just loud enough for nearby tables to catch fragments. "That's the fellow from the intersection. I drove past after it happened. He was directing traffic around the wreck like he'd been born to it." His wife frowned, studying Marcus with new interest. "Is he police?" "Don't know, but he wasn't guessing." Brooke turned toward the hostess, and her voice carried that particular quality of command that came from years spent making boardrooms bend to her analysis, not loud, not aggressive, just absolutely certain that it would be heard and heeded. "He's my date." The silence that followed those 3 words felt heavy enough to crack foundations. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't do anything except stand exactly where he was. Jacket still folded over his arm, waiting to see what came next with the kind of patience that suggested he'd learned long ago that vindication rarely arrived on schedule. The humiliation hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape, distributed its weight differently across the room. Now it lived in the hostess's reddening face, in the whispers spreading from table to table, in the way power dynamics shifted when truth collided with assumption and won. The hostess cleared her throat, professional mask slipping back into place despite cracks visible at every seam. "Of course. Ms. Sullivan, my apologies for the confusion. Your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated." She gestured toward the window table with a trembling hand, already mentally composing explanations and apologies that would probably cost her this job by morning. Marcus looked at Brooke, giving her the choice without speaking it aloud. They could sit, they could leave, they could turn this evening into something other than the disaster it had been shaping up to become. Brooke met his gaze and saw something there that made her next words come easier than they should have, given how her hands were shaking with delayed adrenaline and recognition and shame. "I'd like that, please." They crossed the dining room together, and the walk felt longer than geography alone could account for. Eyes tracked their progress. Whispers followed like a wake. The hostess hurried ahead to pull out Brooke's chair, her apology lodged somewhere between her throat and her professional pride, unable to find voice that wouldn't make things worse. Marcus waited until Brooke was seated before taking his own chair, placing his jacket carefully over the back with the same deliberate precision that seemed to govern all his movements. The menu lay untouched between them, its embossed lettering and prefix options suddenly irrelevant compared to the conversation they needed to have. "I'm sorry." The apology came fast, automatic, insufficient. Marcus shook his head, a small motion that carried more weight than the gesture suggested. "Not your fault." "That doesn't make it okay." "No, it doesn't." The simplicity of his agreement disarmed her more effectively than argument would have. He didn't need her to fix this, Didn't need her to perform guilt or outrage on his behalf. Just needed her to see what had happened clearly and not pretend it away with excuses that would make her feel better while changing nothing about the reality of what men like him faced in spaces like this. A server materialized beside their table, smile bright and practiced, asking about drinks with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested management had already briefed staff on handling whatever this situation had become. Brooke ordered water. Marcus did the same. When the server retreated, Brooke leaned forward slightly, studying his face with the same intensity she probably brought to due diligence reports and market analyses. "I didn't recognize you at first. I should have. Your vision was compromised. Stress responses affect memory formation." The clinical accuracy of his observation made her blink. Most people offered comfort. He offered information. She found it oddly steadying. "Everything happens so fast." "It usually does. But you—" She trailed off, searching for words that would capture what she'd experienced from inside the crumpled remains of her Tesla. "You knew exactly what to do." Marcus considered this while their water-arrived glasses clinking gently against the table. The server lingered just long enough to confirm they needed more time with the menu, then disappeared with practiced efficiency. "I knew how to keep things from getting worse. That's not the same as fixing them." Brooke absorbed the distinction, recognizing humility that came from experience rather than false modesty. At the neighboring table, the elderly man was leaning toward his companion again. Voice pitched low, but carrying nonetheless. "The paramedic told me someone with serious training must have stabilized her before they arrived, kept her from going into shock, managed the crowd." His companion frowned, clearly trying to reconcile the man sitting calmly across from Brooke with whatever image the description had conjured. "What does he do?" "I have no idea." Brooke heard the exchange and felt something shift in her chest, some combination of awe threading through embarrassment that made her next words come out softer than she'd intended. "You never mentioned any of that. The training, the experience." Marcus met her eyes across the table, his expression neutral but not unkind. "You didn't ask." Fair enough. She'd been too busy bleeding and trying not to panic to conduct an interview. The thought almost made her laugh, but the sound died somewhere in her throat when she really looked at him. The scars on his hands that she could see now in good light. The way he held himself with the kind of controlled stillness that suggested someone who'd learned when movement mattered and when it didn't. The watch on his wrist, simple worn analog that she remembered from the accident, because he'd checked it while taking her pulse. "Where did you learn to do what you did today?" "Army. I was a medic for 4 years. The information landed with weight she hadn't expected. Military service explained the bearing the calm under pressure, the way he seemed to assess situations in layers that most people never bothered to examine. It didn't explain why he'd ended up here on a blind date arriving by bus. "And now I work at St. Catherine's Hospital. Orderly staff." Brooke's surprise must have shown on her face because something flickered across his expression, too quick to name, but carrying what looked like resignation. People always reacted to that information. The disconnect between visible capability and actual position created cognitive dissonance that most couldn't process without judgment creeping in. "Why not nursing or paramedic with your training?" Life changed, priorities shifted. The deflection was gentle but absolute. He wasn't going to elaborate, and she was too smart to push. Instead, she noticed his phone light up on the table between them, watched him glance at the screen. Saw his entire face soften in a way that transformed him from careful stranger into someone capable of tenderness that went bone deep. He typed a quick response, fingers moving with the same precision that seemed to govern everything he did. Then looked up with what might have been apology. "My son. Homework question. You have a son." The surprise in her voice made Marcus smile properly for the first time that evening, small and genuine and carrying the kind of pride that needed no explanation. "Cole. He's 9, best thing that ever happened to me." Brooke watched him type another message, watched him prioritize a child's homework over their conversation without hesitation or excuse. and felt something in her chest respond to the casual declaration of where his loyalties lived. Most men she knew either didn't have children or treated them like accessories to be mentioned when convenient. Marcus wore fatherhood like a second skin. Just the two of you. Yeah, his mother left when he was 2. We haven't heard from her since. No bitterness, no self-pity, just facts delivered with the same straightforward honesty that seemed to characterize everything about him. Brooke tried to imagine raising a child alone while working full-time, tried to picture the logistics and sacrifices and constant weight of responsibility, and couldn't quite make the pieces fit into any reality she understood. That must be hard, Marcus finished when she couldn't find the right word. Sometimes, but he's worth every difficult day, every missed opportunity, every choice I've made to be his father first and everything else second. The declaration hung between them, clarifying without accusation. This was why an army-trained medic worked as a hospital orderly. This was why he took the bus instead of driving. This was why flexible hours mattered more than prestige or advancement. Cole came first. Everything else arranged itself around that immovable center. I don't have children. I work constantly. Sometimes I'm not sure there's much else to me besides the job. Marcus studied her for a moment, then offered something that sounded like acceptance rather than judgment. Different paths, both valid. The server returned, hovering with menus in speculative interest. They ordered without much attention to what they were requesting, both of them more focused on the conversation than the food that would eventually arrive. When they were alone again, Brooke found herself watching his hands as he reached for his water glass, remembering how steady they'd been when everything around them had been chaos. The watch. I remember it from the accident. Marcus glanced down at the worn-faced, simple leather band hands that moved with mechanical precision, unmarred by digital interference. Had it since my last deployment. Keeps good time. It saved my life today. He looked up at that, questioning. You used it to check my pulse, to count my breathing. You kept looking at it like you were tracking something important. I was. Timing matters in trauma response. Too fast means you miss things. Too slow means windows close. The clinical explanation didn't diminish the intimacy of the memory. She'd been hurt, frightened, losing her grip on control in ways that still made her chest tight thinking about it. And he'd been there using a cheap analog watch to measure out the seconds that meant the difference between stabilization and deterioration. Their food arrived, steam rising from plates that probably cost more than Marcus's daily wage. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, the initial tension having burned away to reveal something easier underneath. Brooke noticed the way he cut his food, precisely checked the temperature before tasting, and recognized habits formed in places where caution meant survival. You really didn't mind walking away back there? The question came out softer than she'd intended, genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Marcus set down his fork, considering his answer with the same care he seemed to bring to everything. I minded. I just didn't need to prove it to anyone except myself. By leaving, by refusing to let someone else's judgment define my worth. The answer settled over her like a weight, challenging assumptions she hadn't realized she'd been carrying about pride and dignity and how men were supposed to respond to disrespect. Most would have fought, argued, made a scene. He'd simply left with his head up and his integrity intact. I would have fought, I know. Your whole posture changed when you realized what was happening. You went into boardroom mode. Brooke laughed, despite herself recognizing the accuracy of his observation. Is that what you call it? That's what it looks like from the outside. All command and certainty, effective in its context, less so here. Because the hostess wasn't trying to negotiate. She was trying to enforce what she thought were the rules of engagement. Can't reason with that. Can only remove yourself from it with as much grace as possible. The wisdom in his words came from somewhere hard-earned, somewhere that had taught him when to fight and when to walk away, and how to tell the difference between battles worth having and insults that only had power if you gave it to them. Brooke found herself wanting to know more about where he'd learned those lessons, what had shaped him into someone who could remain calm while being publicly humiliated. His phone buzzed again. This time the message made him smile in a way that crinkled the corners of his eyes, transforming tiered features into something younger and more open. He typed a response that took longer than the previous ones, added an emoji she couldn't see, and set the phone aside with visible reluctance. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, Cole wanted to know if I was having fun." "Are you?" Marcus looked directly at her, and the honesty in his gaze made her breath catch slightly. "More than I expected to." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and real in ways that first dates rarely achieved. Brooke set down her fork, leaned back slightly, and tried to reconcile the man across from her with the assumptions she'd built from a dating profile and a brief text exchange. Nothing matched. Or rather, everything matched in ways she hadn't anticipated, revealing depths that two-dimensional summaries couldn't capture. "I need to confess something." Marcus waited, patient as stone. "I almost canceled. I've been working on this acquisition deal that's consuming every waking hour. Rachel, she's my assistant, practically forced me to keep this date. Told me I needed a life outside the office." Smart assistant. Usually. Tonight I'm not so sure. Because I'm sitting across from someone who literally saved my life this afternoon, and I almost stood him up to review market projections. Marcus considered this, then offered something that looked like understanding rather than judgment. "The projections will still be there tomorrow. This is less certain." The observation carried truth that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd built an empire by prioritizing work over everything else, by making the choice to sacrifice personal connection on the altar of professional achievement. Sitting here now, watching a man who'd walked away from advancement to be present for his son, she felt the first stirrings of something that might have been doubt about whether her ladder had been leaning against the right wall all along. "Do you ever regret it? The choices you made? Which ones? Staying small, working a job that doesn't use even half of what you're capable of?" Marcus didn't bristle at the implied criticism in her question. Instead, he seemed to genuinely consider it, turning the idea over in his mind like a stone examined for hidden facets. "I'm not small. I'm focused. There's a difference. Explain it to me." "Small would be doing less than I'm capable of. Focused is directing capability toward what matters most. Cole matters most. Everything else arranges itself around that fact." The clarity of his priorities made Brooke's own suddenly feel muddled and uncertain. She'd spent 15 years building Sullivan and Morrison Capital into a powerhouse that moved markets and made fortunes. What did she have to show for it besides money in accounts she barely had time to spend and an apartment that felt more like a hotel than a home? "I envy that, the certainty. It comes with costs. Like sitting in restaurants wondering if I belong. Like watching Cole's friends go to camps we can't afford. Like knowing I could probably do more with my training but choosing not to because the hours wouldn't work." The honesty of his answer stripped away any romanticization she might have been tempted toward. His life wasn't noble poverty or simple contentment. It was constant negotiation between what he wanted to give his son and what their circumstances allowed. But within those constraints, he'd built something that felt more solid than anything she'd constructed with exponentially more resources. A commotion near the bar pulled their attention. A man sat hard on a stool, breathing too fast, face going pale in the way that signaled panic rather than physical emergency. The bartender hovered uncertainly. Other patrons turned to look without moving to help. That particular paralysis Brooke was starting to recognize as the default human response to crisis without leadership. Marcus was on his feet before conscious thought could have crossed the distance from stimulus to action. He moved toward the bar with purpose, but not panic already assessing as he went. Brooke watched him kneel beside the man, saw his lips moving in what she recognized now as counting, saw him check his watch with that same precise attention to timing that had kept her breathing regulated this afternoon. The man's breathing began to slow. Color started returning. The bartender relaxed fractionally. Marcus stayed exactly where he was until the immediate crisis passed, then stood and returned to their table as if nothing had interrupted the evening's flow. He sat back down, picked up his fork and resumed eating as though he hadn't just talked someone down from a panic attack in the middle of their first date. Brooke stared at him, mesmerized by the casual competence, the absolute lack of fanfare or self-congratulation. This was simply who he was when the world needed something. Present, capable, then immediately back to whatever he'd been doing before, carrying no expectation of praise or acknowledgement. "You keep doing that." Marcus looked up, genuinely confused. "Doing what?" "Stepping into emergencies like they're just part of the landscape, like helping is as natural as breathing." He considered this while chewing thoughtfully, then offered a shrug that suggested the question itself was foreign to his operating system. "It keeps happening. Someone has to respond. But why does it have to be you? Why not me?" The counter-question hit her harder than any declaration could have. He wasn't driven by hero complex or need for validation. He simply saw problems and possessed skills to address them, and couldn't conceive of standing by when action was possible. It was the most fundamental expression of character she'd ever witnessed, and it made every man she'd dated before feel shallow by comparison. Their check arrived. Marcus reached for it automatically. Brooke put her hand over his, stopping the motion. "Let me, please. We can split it. I know we can, but I'm asking you to let me pay." He studied her face, searching for condescension or pity, finding neither. She simply wanted to buy him dinner, wanted to mark this evening as something worth investing in, wanted to acknowledge, however inadequately, that he'd given her something today that transcended the mechanical transaction of saving her life. "All right, but I cover the tip." They negotiated the compromise, both of them protecting their dignity in ways that felt necessary, even if logic suggested it shouldn't matter who paid for what. When the transaction was complete, they stood and moved toward the exit together. The hostess had disappeared, probably into the manager's office, to face consequences that felt simultaneously too severe and not nearly severe enough. Outside, mist had started falling, that Pittsburgh summer humidity finally deciding to commit to precipitation without quite becoming rain. Streetlights haloed in the moisture, turning the sidewalk into something almost romantic if you squinted and ignored the smell of hot asphalt cooling. "Can I walk you to your car?" Brooke nodded, appreciating the old-fashioned courtesy, even as part of her noted the gender dynamics it implied. They moved down the block at a pace that suggested neither of them was eager for the evening to end, despite its rocky beginning. Conversation shifted to safer topics. Work that demanded decisions versus work that demanded patience. The strange courage required by parenting. The difference between being useful and being seen. They'd made it perhaps 3 blocks when they came across the man sitting on the curb. His breathing was fast and shallow, panic written across every line of his body. A woman stood beside him, hands fluttering uselessly, fear, making her voice climb toward hysteria as she tried to talk him through something she clearly didn't understand. Marcus didn't even pause in his stride. He simply diverted course, knelt beside the man, and began the same process Brooke had now seen him execute 3 times in the span of 6 hours. His voice dropped into that particular register of calm authority. His hand found the man's wrist, checking pulse while simultaneously providing anchor. His watch came out, timing breaths, tracking recovery, measuring progress, invisible to anyone who hadn't been trained to see it. Brooke stood back, watching him work with something that felt dangerously close to awe. This wasn't performance, wasn't even conscious choice. It was simply who he became when someone needed help. The competence was staggering, the humility afterward even more so. When the man had stabilized enough to sit up properly, when the immediate crisis had passed, Marcus stood and returned to her side as if this was simply what people did when they encountered strangers in distress. "This is what you do, not just today, not just for me, just constantly." He seemed puzzled by the observation, as though she'd pointed out that he breathed or blinked or performed any other automatic function. "Someone has to." They reached her Tesla parked where the tow truck had delivered it after emergency repairs. The body shop had worked fast, motivated by the check she'd written without question. Money solved problems when you had enough of it. It just couldn't buy the kind of competence she'd witnessed tonight. Brooke stopped beside the driver's door, reluctant to end this despite not knowing what came next. Marcus stood a respectful distance away, giving her space while simultaneously being present. The balance felt precisely calibrated, suggesting someone who'd learned to navigate the complicated terrain between availability and pressure. I don't want this to be just a story, something I tell people about the blind date that turned into rescue scenarios. Marcus studied her face, searching for something she wasn't sure she knew how to show. When he spoke, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than expectation. What do you want it to be? The question hung in the mist between them, inviting honesty that first dates rarely demanded. Brooke took a breath, felt her ribs protest slightly, and let the discomfort ground her in the moment. I want to see you again. Not because you saved me. Not out of gratitude or obligation, just because I want to know more about who you are when crisis isn't defining the interaction. Marcus smiled, then something small and real that transformed his features from careful to genuinely pleased. I'd like that too. They exchanged numbers with the awkward efficiency of two people who'd skipped several stages of typical dating progression and had to backfill the basics after already seeing each other at their respective worst. Brooke suggested coffee for the next meeting, something low pressure where emergency services wouldn't be required. Marcus agreed, already mentally checking his schedule against Cole's needs. He waited until she was safely in her car before turning to walk toward the bus stop 6 blocks away. Brooke sat with the engine running, watching him disappear into the mist, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with accident trauma and everything to do with recognizing that she'd just met someone who might actually see past the armor she'd been wearing for so long she'd forgotten there was still person underneath. Her phone buzzed. Rachel checking in on the date. Brooke ignored it. Instead, she stared at the new contact in her phone, Marcus Reed, with a number and nothing else, and tried to understand how an evening that had started with humiliation had transformed into something that felt like possibility. She put the car in gear and pulled into traffic, heading toward her penthouse apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture and carefully curated emptiness. Tomorrow she'd return to the acquisition deal, to the endless meetings and market analyses and pursuit of growth that had defined her adult life. But tonight, driving through Pittsburgh's summer mist, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to build something with someone who measured success by a 9-year-old's drawings instead of quarterly earnings. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, which seemed appropriate for a day that had started with her car being demolished and ended with her discovering that sometimes the wrong table was exactly where you needed to be. Marcus reached the bus stop and checked the schedule with his phone's flashlight, calculating arrival times against Cole's bedtime routine. He'd be home in 45 minutes. Late enough that Cole would be in pajamas, but early enough to read together before lights out. The math worked, which was all that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text. Cole's drawing updated since this morning, now showing 3 stick figures instead of 2. The third was smaller than the other 2, labeled in careful 9-year-old printing maybe. Marcus stared at the image, understanding flooding through him. His son had somehow intuited that tonight meant something had made space in their family of 2 for the possibility of expansion. The bus arrived. Marcus boarded, found a seat, and let exhaustion pull at him while his mind replayed an evening that had contained more emotional range than the previous 2 years combined. He'd been publicly judged and found wanting. He'd been recognized and vindicated. He'd performed CPR on a stranger's panic and counted breaths for 3 separate people. He'd shared a meal with a woman who'd looked at him like he was worth seeing. The city scrolled past the windows in familiar patterns of light and shadow. This was his route. These were his streets. This life, modest and focused and built around Cole's needs, was the one he'd chosen. Nothing about tonight changed that fundamental architecture, but as the bus carried him home through Pittsburgh's summer evening, Marcus allowed himself to wonder if maybe there was room in the structure for something more, something that looked like connection. something that felt like the beginning of a story that didn't require crisis to justify its existence. His phone buzzed again. Not Cole this time. A number he'd just added. A message simple and direct like the woman who'd sent it. "Thank you for tonight. For all of it." Marcus typed a response, then deleted it. Tried again. This time he kept it simple. "Thank you for seeing past the wrong table." He hit send and watched the message disappear into digital ether. Outside the window, the city breathed its humid breath against glass. Inside the bus, other passengers dozed or scrolled or stared at nothing. And somewhere in the space between where he'd been and where he was going, Marcus Reed let himself hope that maybe this time walking away had actually been walking towards something worth the risk. The phone call came at 10:17 on Saturday morning, shattering the fragile optimism Marcus had carried home from the previous night. The school's vice principal used that particular tone reserved for emergencies that weren't quite dire enough to warrant ambulances, but serious enough to demand immediate parental presence. "Mr. Reed, there's been an incident. Cole fell from the climbing structure during morning playground time. We need you here." Marcus's stomach dropped into his boots. His hands so steady when dealing with strangers' crises suddenly felt clumsy as he grabbed his keys and wallet. The Uber cost $15 he'd been saving for Cole's birthday next month, but buses didn't run fast enough when your child was hurt and calling for you. The school sat on the eastern edge of their neighborhood, a squat brick building that had weathered 4 decades of Pittsburgh winters and showed every year in cracked mortar and patched roof tiles. Marcus pushed through the main entrance at a pace just shy of running, following signs to the nurse's office. With muscle memory that came from too many similar summons over 9 years of single parenting. Cole sat on the examination table, cradling his left wrist against his chest. His face had gone pale but dry, the kind of controlled expression that meant he was trying very hard not to cry in front of adults who weren't his father. When he saw Marcus, something in his composure cracked. "Dad, it really hurts." Marcus crossed the small room in 3 strides, his training screaming assessments his heart didn't want to acknowledge. Swelling, discoloration, the angle suggesting fracture rather than sprain. He knelt beside the table, bringing himself to Cole's eye level, and his voice came out rougher than intended. "Let me see, buddy. Don't move it. Just let me look." His fingers probed gently, professionally checking for displacement while his chest constricted with fear. That had nothing to do with medical assessment and everything to do with being a father watching his son hurt. Cole hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away, trusting Marcus even when touch brought pain. "We need x-rays. It's probably fractured." The nurse nodded, already pulling up the hospital information on her computer. Marcus felt his throat tighten, moisture gathering at the corners of his eyes that he blinked away before Cole could notice. This was different from helping strangers. This was his child, his responsibility, his failure to protect even when protection wasn't possible. Cole's free hand found Marcus's shoulder, squeezing with surprising strength for someone so small and hurt. "Dad, you taught me to breathe. Remember, you should probably do that." The gentle reminder from his 9-year-old son cut through panic better than any emergency protocol. Marcus inhaled deliberately, held it released. Did it again. Cole watched him with those serious eyes that seemed too old for his face, waiting until his father's breathing steadied before speaking again. "I'm okay, really. The bone doctor will fix it." The casual reference to orthopedics made Marcus almost smile despite everything. Cole had spent enough time in hospitals visiting his father at work that medical terminology felt like a second language. They'd turned it into a game years ago, Marcus teaching anatomy and procedures the way other fathers taught baseball statistics. St. Catherine's emergency department held the peculiar tension of Saturday morning chaos, less critical than Friday nights, but busier than weekday hours when people still had options besides the ER. Marcus signed them in at registration, acutely aware that he was now on the patient's side of the equation rather than staff. The distinction felt more profound than it should have. Dr. Okonkwo appeared in the waiting area 40 minutes later, her expression shifting from professional concern to something softer when she recognized them. She'd been Marcus's supervisor for 3 years, and had met Cole enough times to know his favorite candy and his tendency to ask questions that would stump most medical students. "Marcus, I heard we had a young Mr. Reed incoming." She led them to an exam room, and Marcus watched her work with the kind of attention that came from being evaluated rather than evaluating. She was thorough, kind, efficient, everything he would have been with someone else's child. But when she suggested Marcus wait outside while she examined Cole properly, something in him resisted. "I can help. I know how to. You can't treat your own son." The words landed gently but with finality. Dr. Okonkwo placed her hand on his arm, the gesture equal parts professional boundary and personal compassion. "Marcus, I will take excellent care of him. But you need to be his father right now, not his medic. Let me do my job so you can do yours." The distinction hurt precisely because it was correct. Marcus nodded, stepped back, felt his hands clench uselessly at his sides. Cole watched this exchange with sharp interest, reading dynamics that most children his age wouldn't notice. "It's okay, Dad. Dr. O knows what she's doing. You always say she's the best." The faith in his son's voice steadied Marcus enough to leave the room. He paced the hallway outside, checking his phone repeatedly out of habit rather than need. A text from Brooke had arrived during the drive over, something about confirming coffee plans for later that week. The normalcy of it felt jarring against his current reality. 20 minutes later, Dr. Okonkwo emerged with Cole in tow. His wrist now properly splinted and his face considerably brighter thanks to the minor pain medication she'd administered. "Clean fracture, 6 weeks in a cast. He'll be fine." The relief that flooded Marcus's system made his knees temporarily unreliable. He leaned against the wall, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and tried to remember how to function when adrenaline wasn't the only thing keeping him vertical. "Thank you." Dr. Okonkwo studied him with that particular intensity that meant she had observations to share beyond the immediate medical situation. She waited until Cole was distracted by cast color options before speaking. "You can't protect him from everything, you know that, right?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "And the skills you have, the training, they're valuable, but not at the expense of living." She let that sit between them, neither pushing nor retreating from the implication. Marcus understood what she was suggesting. That maybe working as an orderly when he could be doing more wasn't nobility but fear. That maybe he was hiding behind flexible hours and proximity to his son instead of trusting that Cole would be okay if Marcus actually used his capabilities fully. The observation stung because it might be true. Cole returned with his choice bright blue with silver stars, and the technician got to work applying the cast with practiced efficiency. Marcus watched his son chat enthusiastically about the process, asking questions about the materials and curing time, and felt pride war with something darker. This resilient, curious, brave kid had come from wreckage. From a marriage that had imploded when the demands of single parenthood proved too much for Cole's mother. From Marcus's determination to give his son stability even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Was that protection or prison? His phone buzzed again. Brooke this time, her message brief and unexpected. "Heard about Cole. Bought him something. Can I bring it by?" Marcus stared at the screen, trying to parse how she'd known. Then remembered Harper, her assistant, had connections throughout the hospital administrative network. Information traveled fast in medical facilities, especially when it involved staff members' families. He typed back, deleted it, tried again. Finally settled on something simple. "ICU waiting room, 2nd floor. We'll be here another hour." Cole noticed him typing and perked up with interest that suggested 9-year-olds were far too observant for anyone's comfort. "Is that Brooke from your date? How do you—" "You smiled at your phone the same way last night. You never smile at work messages." Marcus tried to find words that would explain adult relationships to a child who'd never seen his father date anyone, gave up and settled for honesty. "Yeah, it's Brooke. She wants to bring you something." Cole's eyes went wide with an excitement that had nothing to do with gifts and everything to do with the implications. "She's coming here to see us. To see you. You're the one with the broken wrist. But Cole wasn't fooled. He settled back against the exam table with a satisfaction that looked far too smug for someone who'd just fractured a bone. Marcus recognized the expression. It was the same one Cole wore when a science experiment yielded exactly the results he'd hypothesized, like pieces were falling into place according to some plan only he understood. 30 minutes later, Brooke walked into the waiting room carrying a bag from a bookstore Marcus couldn't afford and wearing weekend clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She looked different outside the restaurant setting, more approachable somehow, despite the obvious quality of her casual blazer and designer jeans. Cole's face lit up with recognition that shouldn't have been possible given they'd never met, but somehow the drawing he'd updated last night had prepared him for this moment. He straightened in his chair, trying to look brave despite the fresh cast and the fatigue pulling at his features. Brooke approached with the kind of careful courtesy that suggested someone who didn't spend much time around children, but was willing to make the effort. She knelt so she was at Cole's level, a gesture Marcus noted and appreciated. "Cole, I'm Brooke. Your dad helped me yesterday and I heard you got hurt today. Thought you might want something to read while that wrist heals." She pulled out a complete set of the Percy Jackson series hardcover editions that Cole had been eyeing longingly at the library for 6 months. His intake of breath was audible joy and surprise mixing into an expression that made Marcus's chest ache. "These are my favorites, but Dad said they're kind of expensive right now." The innocent observation landed with the weight of unintended revelation. Brooke's expression flickered, not pity, something more thoughtful, before settling back into warm neutrality. "Well, every kid who's brave enough to survive the climbing structure deserves good books. Your dad told me you like mythology. I love it. Do you know the stories about Theseus and the Minotaur? It's about this guy who has to go into a maze and—" Cole launched into an enthusiastic explanation that demonstrated both his intelligence and his tendency to assume everyone found his interests as fascinating as he did. Brooke listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, asking questions that suggested she was actually tracking his somewhat scattered narrative. Marcus watched them interact and felt something shift in his understanding of the previous evening. This wasn't obligation or gratitude. She'd researched what his son liked, spent money that probably meant nothing to her bank account but everything to Cole's excitement, and was now sitting on a hospital floor letting a 9-year-old lecture her about Greek mythology without any visible impatience. Dr. Okonkwo passed by on her way to another patient, caught sight of the scene, and raised her eyebrows at Marcus with an expression that clearly communicated approval mixed with curiosity. He tried to keep his face neutral and failed entirely. When Cole finally paused for breath, Brooke stood and turned her attention to Marcus. Something passed between them, unspoken but weighted with acknowledgement that this gesture meant more than surface kindness. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to. Besides, any kid who reminds his dad to breathe during a crisis is someone I want to know better." Cole beamed at this assessment of his character. Marcus felt his throat tighten again, but for entirely different reasons than earlier panic. The pieces of his carefully compartmentalized life were beginning to blur at the edges, categories he'd kept separate starting to overlap in ways that felt simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. They left the hospital together, Brooke walking them to the bus stop despite having her car parked in the visitor lot. Cole chattered about the books, about casts, about everything except the fact that his father's date from last night was now standing with them at a bus stop in downtown Pittsburgh. The normalcy with which he'd accepted her presence suggested either remarkable adaptability or the kind of hope that children carried better than adults. When the bus arrived, Brooke surprised them both by asking about coffee later in the week. Not as a tentative question, but as a statement of intent, as though the previous night had settled something that now simply required logistics. Marcus agreed, too aware of Cole watching the exchange with undisguised interest. As the bus pulled away, he glanced back to see Brooke still standing there watching them go with an expression he couldn't quite parse. But that looked like someone making calculations that went beyond simple dating arithmetic. Monday morning brought Marcus back to the hospital for his regular shift. Cole safely deposited at school with strict instructions to avoid climbing structures and detailed explanations for teachers about caste care. The weekend had passed in a blur of reading together, Cole already halfway through the first Percy Jackson book discussing mythology, with the kind of enthusiasm that made parenting feel like the most important job Marcus could possibly hold. Across the city, Brooke sat in the glass-walled conference room of Sullivan and Morrison Capital, preparing to do what she did best: dismantle someone's overconfidence through superior preparation and strategic patience. The acquisition target team sat across the table, three men in their 50s who'd built a regional logistics company into something significant, and now wanted to sell for a price that suggested they thought success made them invincible. Their CEO, Thomas Garrett, had the particular arrogance that came from never being told no by people whose livelihoods depended on his good favor. "Ms. Sullivan, our price is firm, 200 million or we walk." Brooke set down her pen with deliberate precision, the small sound carrying more weight than Garrett's declaration. She'd spent the weekend reviewing their financials with an attention to detail that would have impressed auditors. More importantly, she'd found the rot underneath the glossy projections. "Mr. Garrett, I appreciate clarity. Let me offer some in return." She opened the folder in front of her, extracted a single page, and slid it across the polished surface. Numbers highlighted in yellow, dates circled in red, a pattern that told a story the acquisition team had hoped remained hidden. "Your Q3 compliance issues with DOT regulations, the violations that haven't been disclosed to potential buyers, the fines that are still being negotiated but will likely exceed $3 million. Garrett's face lost color. His legal counsel leaned forward, mouth opening to object or deflect or deploy whatever strategy they'd prepared for being caught. Brooke continued before he could speak. "When your board learns that you've been presenting financial projections that don't account for this liability, they're going to have questions. Questions that make 200 million look less like firm pricing and more like wishful thinking." The silence that followed carried the particular quality of power shifting hands. Garrett tried to recover, but his bluster had evaporated. His team exchanged glances that suggested internal communications would be tense for the foreseeable future. Brooke waited comfortable in the space that uncertainty created. "What's your offer?" She'd won. They both knew it, but she'd learned years ago that crushing opponents completely often led to complications during integration. Better to leave them a dignified exit that still served her purposes. 165. I'll structure the deal to minimize the compliance exposure for both parties. Your board gets a clean exit. We get an asset at fair market value considering the actual risk profile. Garrett stared at the papers in front of him, calculations running behind eyes that had underestimated her from the moment she'd walked into the room. Finally, he nodded. "We'll need to bring this to the board." "Of course. You have 48 hours. She stood signaling the meeting's conclusion with body language that brooked no negotiation. Her team filed out behind her, and once they were safely in the elevator, David Morrison let out a low whistle. "You just saved us $35 million. I did due diligence. They gambled that we wouldn't dig deep enough." David studied her with the familiarity of a decade-long partnership. Something had changed in her since Friday night. A sharpness that had always existed but now carried different weight. He didn't comment, but she felt the observation nonetheless. Back in her office, Harper brought coffee and the week's calendar with the kind of efficiency that made her indispensable. She hesitated before leaving something clearly on her mind. "How's Cole?" The question shouldn't have surprised Brooke. Harper knew everything that happened in her life often before Brooke did, but the genuine concern in her assistant's voice created unexpected warmth. "Healing. 6 weeks in a cast. His father is probably worrying more than necessary." Harper smiled with the particular knowledge of someone who'd watched her boss's personal life from a safe distance for 2 years, and was seeing changes worth noting. "You brought him books. He likes mythology? You researched his interests and spent Saturday morning in a hospital waiting room." The observation hung between them, neither accusation nor approval. just fact delivered with the precision that made Harper valuable beyond her administrative skills. Brooke met her assistant's eyes and decided honesty was simpler than deflection. "I'm not sure what I'm doing." "That might be a good thing. You're usually very sure about everything." Harper left before Brooke could formulate a response to that particular piece of wisdom. Alone in her office, surrounded by the trappings of success she'd spent 15 years accumulating, Brooke found herself thinking about a man who'd walked away from a restaurant with his dignity intact and a 9-year-old who reminded his father to breathe during emergencies. The contrast between her world and theirs felt vast, unbridgeable. She moved markets, they rode buses, she negotiated millions. He worried about the cost of hardcover books. The gulf should have made connection impossible. Instead, it made her question which side of the divide actually had their priorities straight. That afternoon, she called David into her office with a proposal she'd been forming since Saturday. He settled into the chair across from her desk with the wariness of someone who'd learned that Brooke's ideas often required him to stretch his definition of what their firm should be doing. "I want to develop an emergency response training program for our portfolio companies." David blinked, processing the seemingly random pivot from their core business. "Explain." "People freeze in crisis. I've seen it twice in 3 days. The workforce at our companies lacks basic competency in handling emergency situations. That creates liability continuity risk and productivity loss when incidents occur. So we're becoming a training company now. We're becoming a firm that protects our investments through comprehensive risk mitigation. Emergency response is an under-addressed risk vector." David leaned back, fingers steepled, considering. He'd built Sullivan and Morrison alongside her father, had been there when she'd taken over after the heart attack that killed him at 45. He trusted her instincts even when they led into unfamiliar territory. Budget, pilot program, $100,000 for 6 months, single company. If it reduces incidents and improves response times, we scale. Who develops the curriculum? The question she'd been waiting for, the one that would either sell the program or sink it before it started. "I have a consultant in mind, someone with extensive field experience in emergency response. Credentials: Army medic, 4 years active deployment, currently works in healthcare, proven track record of effective crisis management." She didn't mention that he worked as a hospital orderly. Didn't mention that she'd met him less than 72 hours ago. Didn't mention that her interest in this program was tangled up with her interest in him in ways she hadn't fully parsed yet. David studied her for a long moment, reading between the lines of what she wasn't saying, then nodded slowly. "Pilot it. But I want measurable metrics, not just feel-good training that looks good in press releases." Agreed. She'd won. Again. But this victory felt different, more personal, more fraught with implications that extended beyond quarterly returns. As David left, Brooke pulled up Marcus's contact information and stared at it for longer than the simple task of initiating a text conversation should have required. Finally, she committed. "Coffee Wednesday, have a business proposition for you." His response came 15 minutes later, probably during a break between patient transport runs. "Define business proposition." She smiled despite herself. Caution looked good on him. "The kind that pays, trust me." Wednesday afternoon found them at a cafe 3 blocks from the hospital, choosing location based on Marcus's schedule rather than atmosphere. The place was functional rather than charming, filled with medical staff on break and students from the nearby community college. Brooke felt overdressed in her work clothes, but Marcus seemed comfortable enough that she tried to mirror his ease. He'd come straight from his shift, still wearing the hospital ID badge that identified him as environmental services staff. The title was deliberately vague, encompassing everything from housekeeping to patient transport, and she noticed how his hand moved to cover it unconsciously when she sat down. She explained the training program idea while their coffee cooled, laying out the concept with the same precision she'd use in a board presentation. Marcus listened without interrupting, his attention complete in a way that most people's wasn't. When she finished, he set down his cup carefully. "You want me to design emergency response training for corporate employees?" "Yes. I'm not a certified trainer. I don't have teaching credentials. You have something better. You have practical experience and an instinct for what works under pressure. I've seen it. You've seen me help 3 people in crisis situations. That's not the same as developing curriculum. His resistance wasn't defensive, just factual. Brooke recognized the pattern, someone who'd been underestimated so often. He'd internalized the criticism, turned it into armor that protected by expecting nothing beyond his current station. What if I told you I think you're capable of more than patient transport? Marcus's expression shifted, something guarded entering his eyes. Then I'd say you don't know enough about my life to make that assessment. So teach me. The challenge landed between them, more personal than professional. Marcus studied her face, searching for condescension or pity, finding neither. She was offering him something, opportunity or complication, maybe both, and waiting to see what he'd do with it. Why does this matter to you? Honest question deserved honest answer. Because I watched you handle 3 emergencies with more competence than I've shown in 15 years of running a company. Because I froze when my car was hit and you didn't. Because whatever you know, other people need to learn. And if I say no, then we drink our coffee and talk about something else. But you won't. The certainty in her voice made him smile despite his obvious reservations. That confident in your assessment? I'm confident in what I saw. The rest is up to you. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, visibly weighing options and obligations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of conditions that mattered more than money. I can advise, not lead. I have Cole to think about. Flexible hours aren't negotiable. Understood. And if this interferes with my ability to be his father, I walk, no matter how much you're paying. The boundary was clear, non-negotiable, and exactly what she'd expected from someone who'd chosen his son over career advancement at every turn. Brooke nodded, accepting the terms without argument. Fair. What else? You'll need to do the actual teaching. My role is designing the approach and advising on implementation. I'm not comfortable being the face of this. That surprised her. Most men she knew would have jumped at the visibility, the chance to be recognized for expertise. Marcus was actively avoiding it, and the humility felt both genuine and frustrating. Why not? Because I'm not trying to build a career in corporate training. I'm trying to help you solve a problem. Those are different goals. The distinction mattered to him in ways she was still learning to understand. Brooke accepted it, even as part of her wondered what it would take to make him see his own value the way she was beginning to. They spent another hour mapping out basics, timeline, budget, potential pilot companies. Marcus's suggestions were practical and grounded in reality rather than theory. He thought in terms of what actually happened when people panicked, not what training manuals suggested should happen. The difference between the two approaches was the difference between effective and performative. When they parted, Brooke found herself energized in ways that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the prospect of building something that mattered beyond profit margins. As she walked back to her office, Harper fell into step beside her with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been waiting. How did it go? He agreed, with conditions, such as, his son comes first, always. Harper studied her boss with an expression that suggested she was seeing something Brooke hadn't fully acknowledged yet. You respect that. Not a question, an observation. Brooke considered denying it, decided honesty was simpler. I do. It's refreshing. Most men I know would have jumped at this opportunity without qualification. Most men you know don't have their priorities straight. The casual assessment carried more weight than Harper probably intended. They continued walking in companionable silence, both of them understanding that something was shifting in Brooke's carefully constructed world. Whether that shift would prove beneficial or catastrophic remained to be seen. The first training session happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after the initial conversation. Marcus had used the intervening time to develop a framework that Brooke had refined into something that looked professional enough for corporate consumption while maintaining the practical edge that made it valuable. They'd rented an empty warehouse space near the Strip District, choosing location based on accessibility and the kind of open floor plan that allowed for scenario practice. 8 employees from a tech startup in Sullivan and Morrison's portfolio filed in, looking skeptical and slightly resentful about spending Friday afternoon on what they clearly expected to be corporate busywork. Brooke stood at the front of the space Marcus positioned deliberately to the side and watched the group settle into folding chairs with varying degrees of attention. She'd learned over the past weeks that his reluctance to lead wasn't fear but philosophy. He believed competence should be distributed, not concentrated, that everyone should be empowered to act rather than waiting for designated responders. We're not here to teach you CPR or first aid. Those are valuable skills, but they're not what freezes people in crisis. The group's attention sharpened slightly. Brooke continued following the script she and Marcus had developed. What freezes people is the absence of permission, the fear of doing something wrong, the assumption that someone else is better qualified to act. We're here to change that. She gestured to Marcus, who stepped forward without fanfare. Set up a scenario. Someone collapses. Go! The group sat frozen, looking at each other uncertainly. One woman pulled out her phone. A man half rose from his chair, then sat back down. The corporate executive who'd been checking email tried to delegate. Should someone call 911? Marcus let the chaos percolate for 90 seconds, then stopped it with a single word. Freeze. Everyone stilled. He moved through the space, gesturing to their positions. Why did you freeze? Answers came haltingly. Don't know what to do. Not my job. Thought someone else would handle it. Marcus nodded to each response without judgment. The problem isn't knowledge. It's permission. You're waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to act. He walked back to the center, and Brooke noticed how naturally command sat on him when he led it, how his voice carried authority that came from experience rather than position. In crisis, permission comes from recognizing need. If someone needs help and you can provide it, you have permission. You don't need credentials or official roles. You need to see what's necessary and do it. The group was fully attentive now. Marcus ran them through the scenario again, this time coaching them to make decisions without waiting for consensus. By the third iteration, response time had dropped from 90 seconds to 15. People were moving, directing, acting without the paralysis that had defined their first attempt. Brooke watched from the periphery, taking mental notes on what worked and what needed adjustment. But mostly she watched Marcus, seeing him in his element in ways that hospital orderly work didn't allow. This was where his training lived, not in patient transport, but in creating competence in others. During a break, Elena Foster, a warehouse manager with 3 kids, approached Marcus directly. This is different from other training I've done. You're not teaching procedures, you're teaching confidence. Marcus considered the observation, then nodded slowly. Procedures matter, but in the moment what matters more is believing you're allowed to use them. Where'd you learn this? Places where hesitation got people killed. The honesty landed without drama, just fact. Elena absorbed it, then offered her own. I've got 3 kids. You learn fast that panic is contagious, so is calm. Exactly. Brooke filed away the exchange, understanding something about Marcus she hadn't fully grasped before. He wasn't teaching from theory or curriculum. He was teaching from memory, from experiences that had carved lessons into him at depths most people never reached. The second session the following week focused on voice control and presence. Marcus demonstrated how tone mattered as much as content, how calm delivery could cut through chaos better than loud authority. Brooke tried the exercises herself, found her natural command voice, the one she used in boardrooms, actually made people more hesitant rather than more confident. You're giving orders. That works when you have recognized authority. In crisis, you don't have time to establish that. You need to invite cooperation. How? Show them what to do by doing it. Ask clear questions instead of giving commands. Who can call 911 is more effective than someone call 911. She tried again, adjusting her approach. The difference was subtle but significant. People responded differently when invited to participate versus ordered to comply. The lesson humbled her in ways that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with recognizing that her strengths in one context were liabilities in another. By the third week, the training had found its rhythm. The group had cohered into something functional, practicing scenarios with increasing sophistication. Marcus remained on the edges, offering corrections and insights, but never taking center stage. Brooke found herself increasingly aware of his proximity during sessions. The way his hand would occasionally touch her shoulder to guide positioning, the way their collaboration had developed its own shorthand. After the third session ended, they walked to her car in companionable silence that felt earned rather than awkward. Pittsburgh's early autumn had started asserting itself, cooling evening air carrying hints of the winter that would arrive too soon and stay too long. "This is working." Marcus nodded, hands in his pockets, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him since they'd started. "Your group is good. They're learning faster than I expected. Because you're a better teacher than you give yourself credit for." He gave her a look that suggested he wasn't ready to accept that assessment, but appreciated the sentiment. They reached her Tesla, and Brooke found herself reluctant to end the evening despite having work waiting at home. Dinner. The invitation came out more tentative than she'd intended. Marcus hesitated, and she could see him calculating obligations and logistics. "I need to get home to Cole, but..." He paused, seemed to make a decision. "You could come with nothing fancy, just leftovers and homework help, but Cole's been asking about you." The offer felt more significant than dinner at any restaurant could have been. An invitation into the actual architecture of his life, rather than the public-facing version people showed on dates. Brooke accepted before she could second-guess the implications. Marcus's apartment occupied the third floor of a building that had seen better decades but maintained dignity through careful maintenance. The hallway smelled of cooking and detergent, sounds of other families bleeding through thin walls in ways that spoke to closeness that wealth couldn't buy. Inside, the space was small but meticulously organized. Cole's drawings covered one wall of the living room, evolution of artistic skill visible in the progression from stick figures to more sophisticated renderings. Schoolwork shared space with sketches of mythological creatures, each piece dated and preserved with the kind of care that spoke to a parent who recognized his child's creativity as treasure. Cole looked up from the kitchen table when they entered, face brightening with recognition that suggested Marcus had mentioned Brooke more than he'd probably intended. "Brooke, did you come for dinner? Dad made spaghetti. He makes good spaghetti." The enthusiasm was contagious. Brooke found herself settling into the domestic scene with surprising ease, helping set an extra place while Marcus heated leftovers and Cole provided running commentary on his school day. The cast on his wrist had accumulated signatures and drawings, transforming medical necessity into social artifact. Over dinner, Cole asked about her work with the kind of genuine curiosity that suggested he'd inherited his father's tendency to actually listen to answers. She tried to explain private equity in terms a 9-year-old could grasp, found herself simplifying concepts she usually kept deliberately complex. "So you help companies get better?" "Sometimes. Other times we buy them and change how they operate." "That sounds hard. What if they don't want to change?" The question was more sophisticated than it seemed. Brooke glanced at Marcus, who was watching the exchange with interest. "Then I have to show them why change is necessary, using information they might not have considered." Cole nodded, processing this. "Like when Dad explains why I need to do something even when I don't want to. He uses facts." "Exactly like that." After dinner, Cole retreated to his room for homework with instructions to ask for help if needed. Marcus and Brooke cleaned dishes in the small kitchen, working in synchronized silence that felt comfortable rather than strained. "He's a good kid. He's everything." The simple declaration carried weight that went beyond parental pride. Marcus dried the last plate, set it in the cabinet with precise placement, and turned to face her with expression suggesting he'd been building towards something. "This program you're building, it's changing how people see themselves. Elena told me after last session that she handled a minor emergency at work this week without freezing. That's the goal. But I need you to understand something. If this starts interfering with my time with Cole, I'm out. No negotiation, no guilt. The boundary was clear and Brooke recognized it for what it was. Not rejection, but priority management from someone who'd already made the hard choices about what mattered most. I understand, but what if there was a way to do both? To use these skills fully without sacrificing your time with him? Marcus studied her curiosity mixing with caution. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet. I'm just thinking out loud about whether flexible hours in your current role is the only solution, or if there are other configurations that would let you be present for Cole while actually using your full capabilities. There aren't. I've looked. The finality in his voice suggested old wounds applications rejected, opportunities denied, because qualifications didn't match experience, or because background didn't fit neat categories. Brooke wanted to argue, wanted to promise she could fix it, but recognized that would be overstepping. Instead, she simply nodded. Okay, but if something changes, tell me, why does this matter to you? The question echoed their conversation at the cafe weeks ago. Brooke considered her answer carefully, aware that Cole was in the next room, potentially listening. Aware that Marcus deserved honesty even when it revealed more than she was comfortable showing. Because watching you teach made me realize I've been doing everything wrong. Using authority where I should be building confidence. Commanding where I should be inviting. You're changing how I see leadership. That matters. Marcus absorbed this expression, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened slightly. You're not doing it wrong. You're just learning there's more than one way to be effective. The distinction felt generous, more charitable than she deserved. Before she could respond, Cole appeared in the doorway, Percy Jackson book in hand. Dad, I don't understand this part about the prophecy. Can you explain? Marcus moved toward his son automatically, and Brooke watched them settle onto the couch together. Heads bent over the book in postures that spoke to years of this ritual. She should have left, should have given them this private time. Instead, she found herself curling into the chair across from them, listening to Marcus explain narrative structure and mythological symbolism with the same patience he brought to emergency response training. Cole eventually noticed her presence, looked between his father and Brooke with calculation that seemed too advanced for his age. Are you going to stay for breakfast? The question hung in the air, weighted with implications that made Marcus's eyes widen slightly in alarm. Brooke bit back a smile. Not tonight, buddy, but maybe another time. Cole accepted this with a nod that suggested he was already planning future scenarios. When she finally left, Marcus walked her down to her car, despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. On the street, Pittsburgh's evening had fully arrived, streetlights casting pools of yellow on cracked pavement. They stood by her car without immediately separating, something building between them that neither had named yet. Cole likes you. I like him too. He's perceptive. Too perceptive sometimes. Brooke laughed, then sobered. Marcus, what are we doing here? I don't know, but it feels worth figuring out. The honesty of the answer settled something in her chest that had been restless since their first dinner. She nodded, accepting the uncertainty as part of the process. Then let's keep figuring it out. She drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror, standing under the streetlight until she turned the corner. The domesticity of the evening should have felt foreign, should have triggered all her usual claustrophobia around anything that resembled commitment. Instead, it had felt like possibility. The fourth week of training brought David Morrison as an observer, his presence shifting the dynamic in subtle ways. He watched Brooke lead the session with attention that felt evaluative rather than supportive. And afterward, he requested a private word that she knew meant complications. They convened in her office Monday morning, David settling into his usual chair with expressions suggesting concerns he'd been accumulating needed airing. The training program is showing results. Elena's company reported improved incident response times, reduced panic during a recent facility alarm. But I've been asking questions about your consultant, Marcus Reed. The shift to first and last name felt ominous. Brooke kept her expression neutral. And hospital orderly. No teaching certifications, no official emergency response credentials beyond expired military training. He has practical experience that exceeds most certified trainers. Practical experience that ended years ago. Brooke, this could be a liability issue. If someone gets hurt following protocols he taught and his qualifications are questioned. His methods work. You've seen the results. I've seen results from a pilot program with 8 participants. That's not the same as scalable, defensible training that can withstand scrutiny if something goes wrong. The argument had merit. Brooke recognized the business logic even as her instinct rebelled against it. David continued, voice careful. I'm not saying shut it down. I'm saying we need proper credentials. Either he gets certified or we bring in someone who already has the paperwork to back up their expertise. The certifications take months. By then, momentum will be lost. Then maybe momentum isn't the right priority. Maybe we need to slow down and do this properly. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, arguments and counter-arguments that ultimately reached stalemate. David wasn't forbidding the program, but he was putting conditions on its expansion that required addressing Marcus's lack of formal credentials. It was reasonable. It was frustrating. It was the reality of trying to build something unconventional within conventional structures. That evening, Brooke met Marcus at the warehouse for what had become their standard post-training debrief. She laid out David's concerns with the same directness she'd used delivering bad news to any business partner, watching his expression close down in ways that suggested this wasn't the first time his capabilities had been questioned due to lack of paperwork. So I'm not qualified. You're absolutely qualified, you're just not credentialed. That's a distinction without a difference in your world. The bitterness surprised her. Marcus rarely showed frustration, but this touched something deeper than professional disappointment. In Afghanistan, no one asked to see my certifications before I worked on them. They just needed me to know what I was doing, which I did. I know you did, I've seen it. But it's not enough. Not here. Not for your partner's comfort level. Brooke wanted to argue, wanted to promise she'd fight this, but she understood David's position too well to dismiss it entirely. Liability mattered. Documentation mattered. The world they were trying to change still operated by rules that didn't make exceptions for competence that couldn't be proven on paper. What if you got certified? There are accelerated programs that cost money I don't have and time I can't spare. Cole needs me present, not studying for exams that test whether I know things I've already proven I know. They'd reached an impasse. The program they'd built together suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces neither of them controlled. Marcus stood preparing to leave, and the distance between them felt wider than physical space alone could account for. Maybe this was a mistake, trying to make something work that doesn't fit either of our actual lives. The resignation in his voice made Brooke's chest tighten. She crossed the space between them without conscious decision, stopping close enough that he'd have to acknowledge her presence. Don't do that. Don't use this setback as an excuse to retreat. I'm not retreating, I'm being realistic. You need someone with credentials. I need to focus on Cole and keeping my actual job. Those aren't compatible. They could be. If you'd let me help. I don't need help. I need what I've always needed. Stability for my son. Everything else is negotiable. The words landed with finality that suggested they were discussing more than just the training program. Brooke recognized the pattern, someone building walls preemptively because rejection hurt less when you saw it coming. She'd done the same thing for years after her father's death, protecting herself from loss by never letting anyone close enough to lose. Marcus, look at me. He did reluctantly. She held his gaze, searching for words that would bridge the gap his fear was trying to create. I'm not asking you to sacrifice Cole. I'm not even asking you to get certified if you don't want to. I'm asking you to trust that we can find a solution that doesn't require you to choose between your child and using your capabilities. There isn't one. I've looked for years. Then let me look. Give me time to figure something out. Why, what's in this for you? The question was fair. She'd been asking herself the same thing since Saturday morning in a hospital waiting room, trying to parse what was professional interest and what was something more complicated. Honestly, I don't know anymore. I started this thinking it was about the training program, about solving a business problem, but somewhere along the way it became about you. The admission hung in the warehouse air, vulnerable and unplanned. Marcus's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that might have been hope, if it hadn't been so carefully guarded. Brooke, I'm not asking for anything. Not yet. I'm just being honest about why I care whether this works or not. They stood in the charged space between acknowledgement and action, both of them aware that whatever happened next would change the trajectory of everything that had been building since that first night at the wrong table. Marcus moved first, closing the remaining distance with deliberation that suggested choice rather than impulse. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with tenderness that felt both surprising and inevitable. I care too, that's what scares me. Then he kissed her and the world narrowed to the point of contact. His lips were warm, firm, carrying the kind of certainty his words had lacked. Brooke's hands found his shoulders, anchoring herself against the vertigo of finally acting on tension that had been building for weeks. When they broke apart, neither moved far. Marcus's forehead rested against hers, breath mingling in the small space between them. This complicates everything. I know. Cole has to come first. I know that too. And if I have to choose, then you choose Cole. I'm not asking you to do anything else. The promise seemed to ease something in him. He kissed her again, softer this time, before stepping back with visible reluctance. They stood looking at each other, acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted even as all the practical obstacles remained exactly where they'd been. Brooke's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. She glanced at the screen, saw David's name, and felt reality reassert itself with unwelcome timing. I have to take this. Marcus nodded, understanding written in his expression. She stepped away, answering with the professional voice that felt increasingly like a mask she wore rather than who she actually was. David? Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Gerald Blackstone wants to discuss the training program. The name alone was enough to signal trouble. Gerald represented old money and older thinking, the kind of board member who viewed any deviation from traditional approaches as suspect. If he'd taken interest in what she was building, it wasn't because he wanted to support it. What's his concern? Optics, liability, the usual, but he's bringing allies. This isn't going to be a friendly conversation. Brooke felt the walls closing in, professional obligations colliding with personal investments in ways that felt increasingly untenable. She ended the call, turned back to Marcus, and saw in his face that he'd heard enough to understand the stakes. Let me guess. Board wants to shut this down. They want to scrutinize it, which amounts to the same thing if I can't defend the approach. Can you? The question wasn't doubting her ability. It was asking whether she wanted to, whether the fight was worth the cost. Brooke considered her answer carefully. Yes, but I need you there. Marcus shook his head immediately. I'm not going into a boardroom to defend my qualifications to people who've already decided I don't have them. Then don't defend qualifications, defend results, show them what we've built. Brooke, 1 hour, that's all I'm asking. Show them why credentials don't matter as much as competence. Make them see what I see. The request was unfair, she knew it even as she made it. But desperation was making her reach for solutions that put him in uncomfortable positions, and she couldn't quite make herself care about the ethics when the alternative was watching something important die before it had a chance to prove its value. Marcus studied her for a long moment, conflict visible in every line of his body. Finally, he nodded with resignation that suggested he already knew he'd regret this. 1 hour, but after that, whatever they decide, we accept it. No more fighting battles that can't be won. Deal. They parted outside the warehouse, the kiss still electric between them but overshadowed by the looming confrontation. Brooke drove home through Pittsburgh's evening streets, mind already constructing arguments and defense strategies. She had 12 hours to prepare for a fight that would determine whether the program survived, and increasingly whether whatever was developing between her and Marcus had a foundation solid enough to weather institutional resistance. The night stretched ahead full of preparation and anxiety. But underneath it all, memory of his hands on her face, his certainty cutting through her doubt. Whatever happened tomorrow, that moment in the warehouse had changed something fundamental. Whether that change would survive contact with reality remained to be seen. The boardroom of Sullivan and Morrison Capital occupied the building's top-floor glass walls, offering panoramic views of Pittsburgh's skyline that seemed designed to remind everyone present of how far they'd climbed. Brooke arrived 40 minutes early, using the time to arrange her presentation materials with precision that masked the anxiety churning through her system. Marcus appeared at 8:30, looking uncomfortable in borrowed business attire that Harper had somehow procured overnight. The dress shirt fit reasonably well, but he moved in it like someone wearing a costume rather than clothing. Cole had stayed home with Jack Brennan, a favor called in that Marcus would spend weeks repaying. "You don't have to do this." Her words came out softer than intended. Marcus met her eyes with expression suggesting he'd already made peace with the decision. "Yes, I do. Not for them. For you." The distinction mattered more than he probably realized. Before she could respond, David arrived, followed by the other board members filing in with the particular gravity that important meetings demanded. Gerald Blackstone entered, last silver hair and tailored suit, announcing his presence before he spoke a word. The meeting began with financial reports, quarterly projections, standard business that felt interminable when bigger stakes waited. Finally, Gerald shifted in his chair with the deliberate movement of someone preparing to strike. "The Emergency Response Initiative. Ms. Sullivan helped me understand the strategic value of this program relative to our core competencies." Brooke had anticipated the angle of attack. She pulled up her presentation, clicked through data showing reduced incident response times, decreased insurance claims, improved employee confidence metrics from the pilot. Risk mitigation with measurable ROI. The pilot company reported 23% faster emergency response and zero escalation of minor incidents that previously would have required extensive remediation. Gerald nodded as though considering this, but his expression suggested he'd already reached conclusions. "And your consultant? Mr. Reed, is it? Walk me through his credentials." The trap was elegant. Brooke could defend results all day, but credentials were facts that couldn't be argued around. She opened her mouth to deflect, but Marcus spoke first. "I don't have traditional credentials. I was an Army medic, 4 years active service. Since then, I've worked in hospitals, maintaining the skills through practical application. So no teaching certification, no emergency response instructor license, no liability insurance covering corporate training. No." The simple admission hung in the air. Gerald leaned back, sensing victory. "Ms. Sullivan, this firm has built its reputation on due diligence and risk management. How does hiring an uncredentialed consultant align with those values?" Brooke felt the board's attention shift, doubt spreading like frost across glass. She'd prepared counter-arguments, had statistics ready about competence versus certification. But before she could deploy them, Marcus continued, "You want to know if I'm qualified to teach people how not to freeze when everything goes wrong? Let me ask you something. How many of you have actually been in a situation where seconds determined whether someone lived or died?" The question landed with weight that changed the room's energy. Gerald's expression flickered with something that might have been offense. "That's hardly relevant." "It's completely relevant, because what freezes people isn't lack of knowledge. It's lack of permission, fear of being wrong, the assumption that someone else is better qualified." Marcus stood, moving to the presentation screen without asking permission. His discomfort with the borrowed suit had vanished, replaced by the same presence Brooke had watched him deploy in crisis after crisis. "Your employees don't need more certifications. They need to believe they're allowed to act, that their judgment matters, that helping is better than waiting for perfect expertise." He pulled up a video from the pilot program, footage of Elena directing an evacuation drill with confidence that transformed her from nervous warehouse manager into someone who could move a crew. The contrast between her first frozen attempt and her final competent execution was striking. That's not something you can teach from a manual. It's something you model. And yeah, maybe I don't have paperwork proving I know how to do that, but the results speak for themselves. Gerald absorbed this, then turned to Brooke. If something goes wrong, if someone gets hurt following protocols he taught, this firm's liability exposure would be significant. David spoke for the first time, his voice measured. I've reviewed the legal implications. With proper waivers and insurance riders, our exposure is manageable. The question isn't whether we can afford the risk. It's whether we believe the program has value. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, arguments circling until Gerald finally called for a vote on whether to continue funding. The result was closer than Brooke would have liked, 5 in favor, 3 against. But it was enough. Gerald's final words carried warning that made victory feel tenuous. 6 months. Show me scalable results with proper risk management or this ends. And Ms. Sullivan, find a way to get your consultant properly credentialed or find someone who already has the paperwork. Outside the building, Marcus loosened the borrowed tie with relief that looked physical. That was brutal. You were brilliant, the way you reframed it. I told them the truth. Whether they believe it is up to them. Brooke wanted to celebrate, wanted to acknowledge that they'd won something important. But Marcus's expression suggested he was already calculating costs rather than victory. What's wrong? Gerald's right. I need credentials, and I don't have time or money to get them. Then we find another way. Her phone buzzed. David, his text terse and urgent. Gerald moved up the timeline. Transit Hub opens Friday. That's your test case. Press will be there. If anything goes wrong, the program dies and probably your partnership with it. Brooke stared at the screen, processing implications. Friday was 4 days away. They'd planned on months to prepare for a major public demonstration. Gerald had just collapsed the timeline into days, stacking the deck for failure. Marcus read her expression. What happened? She showed him the message. His face tightened, but he didn't argue or complain, just started thinking through logistics with the same systematic approach he brought to every crisis. We'll need the full team, intensive preparation. Cole will have to stay with Jack. Marcus, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm choosing, but if this doesn't work, I'm done. No more fighting your board. No more trying to prove something they've already decided not to see. The resignation in his voice hurt more than anger would have. They'd built something together, and institutional resistance was grinding it down into something that cost more than either of them should have to pay. That night, she drove to his apartment unannounced, found him at the kitchen table helping Cole with a history project about the Great Depression. The domestic scene pulled at something in her chest that she'd spent years keeping carefully locked away. Cole brightened when he saw her. Brooke. Do you know about Herbert Hoover? Dad says he tried his best, but circumstances were too hard. Marcus shot her a look that suggested the history lesson contained subtext about current situations. Brooke settled into the chair across from them, letting herself be pulled into homework help that felt more real than any boardroom victory. After Cole went to bed, she and Marcus sat on the small balcony, Pittsburgh's lights spreading below them like a map of other people's choices. This Friday could end everything. Marcus's observation wasn't dramatic, just factual. The Transit Hub opening was high-profile, heavily covered, exactly the kind of event where failure would be public and permanent. Then we make sure nothing ends. We prepare like our lives depend on it. Your career depends on it. My life depends on being able to provide for Cole regardless of whether your board thinks I'm qualified. The distinction cut deep, reminding her of fundamental differences in their stakes. She could survive professional failure. He couldn't afford any kind that disrupted his ability to parent. I'm sorry, I pulled you into this. No, I walked into it. But I'm walking out with clear eyes about what matters most. Thursday night, they ran the team through final scenarios at the warehouse. Elena Jackson, the others who'd transformed from frozen employees into people who could direct crowds and make decisions under pressure. Watching them work felt like witnessing minor miracles, small proofs that competence could be taught even when credentials couldn't be bought. Marcus worked them hard, pushing past comfort into the kind of stress that revealed whether learning would hold when everything went wrong. Brooke observed from the periphery, understanding that this was potentially their last night doing this together. After tomorrow, either the program would be vindicated or dismantled. Friday morning arrived with weather that matched the stakes: overcast, threatening rain, the kind of day that made outdoor events feel precarious even before crisis intervened. The Union Street Transit Hub had been under renovation for 18 months, and its grand reopening promised to showcase Pittsburgh's commitment to infrastructure modernization. Brooke arrived early, positioning their team throughout the venue while trying to ignore the knot in her stomach that suggested disaster waiting to happen. Mayor's staff bustled around, adjusting podium heights and testing microphones. Press set up cameras. 400 invitations had been extended, and the attendance suggested most had been accepted. Gerald Blackstone appeared near the VIP section, flanked by David and 2 other board members. His presence felt less like support and more like a vulture waiting to pick apart wreckage. Marcus stood near the main platform level, casual clothes blending him into the crowd while his team dispersed to positions they'd practiced. Cole had wanted to come, had argued passionately about being part of something important. Marcus had refused with firmness that allowed no negotiation. Some things were too risky even for brave 9-year-olds. The mayor's speech began at 11, full of optimistic declarations about connectivity and progress. Brooke barely heard it, her attention divided between watching the crowd and watching Marcus watch the crowd. His stillness felt different from everyone else's, predatory rather than passive, ready for movement that hadn't yet become necessary. 11:47. The electrical short happened without warning, sparks showering from an overhead display panel that construction crews had forgotten to properly disconnect. Small fire, easily containable. But 400 people didn't know that. They saw flames and sparks and felt panic rising like floodwater. The crowd moved as one organism, surging toward exits that couldn't handle the sudden pressure. Brooke saw bottlenecks forming, saw parents grabbing children, saw elderly attendees stumbling. This was the moment. Either their training held or people got hurt and the program died. Elena was first to act, her voice cutting through rising chaos with authority that had been practiced but now felt natural. "Stop! Alternative exits this way." She spread her arms, creating physical barrier that redirected flow. Jackson positioned himself at the main stairwell, slowing the surge with deliberate calm that prevented stampede. "One at a time. You're safe. One at a time." Marcus didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, trusting his training to multiply through people he'd taught. Brooke understood this had to work without him taking over. The program's value was in distributed competence, not in one expert being everywhere at once. An elderly man collapsed near the concessions, clutching his chest while his wife screamed for help. Sarah from the tech startup knelt beside him, checking pulse exactly the way she'd been taught. "Sir, can you hear me? Someone get the AED." Her voice held steady despite her hands shaking slightly. Marcus had told them fear was normal, that acting despite fear was the definition of courage. Sarah was proving him right, making decisions that mattered while waiting for professional responders to arrive. The fire suppression system activated, containing the electrical fire within seconds. But the damage had been done to crowd psychology. 400 people thought they were in danger, and belief made reality irrelevant. Brooke saw her moment, understood what Marcus had been trying to teach her for weeks. She stepped onto an elevated planter, made herself visible. "Listen to me." Her voice carried command that came from boardrooms but carried calm she'd learned from him. The crowd didn't stop moving, but the quality of movement changed: less panic, more direction. "Fire department is 2 minutes away. We will all get out safely if you follow instructions. North side exit through the marked doors. South side follow the green signs. Walk with purpose. Do not run." Her team amplified the message, each of them directing their section with voices that stayed level even when fear wanted to climb. The crowd began organizing itself, turning chaos into managed evacuation. Fire trucks arrived at 11:53, finding a situation already being handled. The fire chief looked around, processing the organized flow, then sought out whoever had taken charge. Multiple firefighters pointed toward Brooke's team, scattered throughout the space, but clearly working in coordination. "Who organized this?" Elena gestured toward Brooke and Marcus both. "We all did. That's the point." By 12:15, the hub was empty except for officials and press. 3 minor injuries. The elderly man with chest pain was stable. 2 people with twisted ankles from the initial surge. 0 fatalities, 0 trampling injuries. 0 of the catastrophic outcomes that could have occurred when 400 people panicked simultaneously. Gerald Blackstone approached Brooke with expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, surprise, reluctant acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. That could have been a disaster. It wasn't, because people knew what to do. Your team performed well. The admission felt dragged from him unwillingly. David appeared beside his colleague, and something passed between them, silent communication that shifted the dynamic. "The board will want a full debrief, but Ms. Sullivan, I think we can safely say the program has proven its value." Marcus had remained in the background, helping guide the last few stragglers toward exits. Dr. Okonkwo materialized beside him, having attended the opening in her capacity as a hospital administrator. She'd watched everything unfold with professional interest that now focused entirely on Marcus. "That was extraordinary. The coordination, the distributed response. You designed that system. We designed it. I just helped with the framework. Marcus, I'm starting a community paramedic program, bridging emergency response with preventive care. Salaried position, flexible schedule, actually using your full skill set. Interested?" The offer hung between them, life-changing in ways that Marcus processed slowly. He glanced toward Brooke, finding her in the crowd, and something in his expression asked permission he didn't actually need. She nodded, feeling joy and loss mix into something complicated. This was what she'd wanted: Marcus using his capabilities fully. But it meant the training program they'd built together would transition into something else. Someone else. "Yeah, I'm interested." The crowd dispersed gradually, press getting their footage, officials making statements about the effectiveness of emergency planning. Brooke found herself standing alone in the cavernous hub, looking at the space where catastrophe had been prevented by people who'd learned to believe in their own competence. Marcus approached, still in his casual clothes that had kept him invisible throughout the crisis. "You did it. We did it. That moment on the planter, that was everything I tried to teach you. Power doesn't make people listen, but calm makes them trust." The quote felt like wisdom earned rather than received. They stood in the emptying hub, understanding that something had ended and something else was beginning. The program would continue without him. His job would change. Their relationship would have to navigate new terrain. "Where does this leave us?" His question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complex. Brooke tried to find words that acknowledged both the impossibility and the determination. "I don't know, but I know I don't want to find out what leaving us means." Marcus smiled, and the expression carried weight of decisions made despite uncertainty. "Cole drew a new picture last night, 3 people and a dog. There's a dog now. He's aspirational." The absurdity of discussing a hypothetical dog after preventing mass casualties made her laugh, and the sound felt like release of pressure that had been building for weeks. Marcus's hand found hers, and they stood together, watching the transit hub return to normal as if crisis had never threatened. 2 months later, Marchand's restaurant looked exactly as it had that first night: chandelier light, white tablecloths, the smell of wealth and careful preparation. Brooke had made reservations under her name this time, requesting their original table by the windows. The hostess who'd dismissed Marcus was no longer employed there. New management had made changes after Brooke's quiet word with the owner about discrimination and lost business. The replacement greeted them with professional courtesy that held no judgment about Marcus's comfortable but inexpensive clothing. "Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Reed, your table is ready." They followed her through the dining room, and if other diners recognized them from news coverage of the transit hub incident, no one stared. Success had a way of changing how people saw you, validating choices that had previously been questioned. Marcus held Brooke's chair settled across from her with ease that suggested the restaurant no longer felt like enemy territory. They ordered without urgency, comfortable enough now to let meals unfold at their own pace. "How's the new position?" "Different, better. I'm actually using everything I know instead of hiding it behind flexibility. And the hours still work with Cole's schedule." He's excited about the house. They'd found a place together, 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood that split the difference between her downtown penthouse and his third-floor walk-up. Not quite compromise, more like deliberate choice of middle ground that served everyone's needs. "He's mostly excited about the dog we haven't agreed to yet." Brooke smiled, recognizing negotiation tactics she'd taught him. "We should probably discuss that. We should probably discuss a lot of things. But tonight, let's just celebrate that we're here, at the wrong table that turned out to be exactly right." The toast felt earned in ways first dates never achieved. They'd survived boardrooms, and crises had built something that combined her strategic thinking with his practical wisdom, had learned to trust each other through friction that would have destroyed less determined partnerships. Brooke's phone buzzed with a photo from Harper. Cole at their new house, standing in the empty backyard with a stick figure drawing showing future plans. 3 people, a dog, and what might have been a treehouse. She showed Marcus, who laughed with pride that came from raising a child who believed in building futures worth planning for. He's negotiating through proxy now. He learned from the best. They finished dinner without crisis interrupting, without needing to rush toward obligations. The city hummed outside, floor-to-ceiling windows full of people making their own choices about what mattered. Inside, 2 people who'd met at the wrong table and somehow found their way toward something right. Shared a meal that felt less like ending and more like beginning. Marcus paid this time, his insistence money earned from work that finally matched his capabilities. Brooke let him, understanding that dignity sometimes required visible proof of contributions, rather than gracious acceptance of imbalance. They walked out together into Pittsburgh evening that promised winter but hadn't quite delivered. Marcus's hand found hers naturally, connection that had survived scrutiny and stress and all the practical obstacles that should have made this impossible. "So what happens next?" Brooke considered the question, then decided honesty was simpler than prediction. "I have no idea, but I'm looking forward to figuring it out." "Same." They walked into the city that had tested them, toward a house that waited with empty bedrooms and future plans. Toward a life that combined his priorities with her ambitions. Toward whatever came next for 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the biggest mistake was exactly where you needed to be. Behind them, Marchand's restaurant continued serving meals to people who knew where they belonged. Ahead, everything was uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. And sometimes that was exactly enough.